The Heretic Order. Chapter 7. Paladin Klein paced the undercroft. Her steps echoed off the walls like a slow, sarcastic clapping. She stopped pacing and looked through the open cell door. Morgan's blood had dried dark brown. It looked more like dried shit than blood. She winced. The guards disposed of his chopped-up remains in the river during the night, then came back to work the next morning as if nothing happened. Klein didn't care that they killed Morgan. He was a heretic. Everyone felt the schism happening in the order, those who had true faith and those who did not. It was time to separate the wheat from the chaff. Klein knew she had the true faith, however, that made her failure sting so much worse. Her eyes filled as she made up her mind and climbed the stairs to the church. She ducked out a side door and down a small alley to the abbot's house. She saw him over the garden wall, bent over and mumbling something to himself. He was pruning 3 bonsai trees arranged by height.
"Abbot Montgomery, Morgan is dead and Owen has escaped,"
she said. The abbot looked up from his Chinese juniper.
"Thank you for being forthright."
The abbot's lack of anger worried Klein. She second-guessed her decision. Had she miscalculated? She glanced at her pistol on her belt for a second, then took a shaking breath. She opened the gate into his garden and fell to her knees. The abbot placed a gentle hand under her chin and raised her head.
"Klein, you haven't failed me. I have wanted a sign for some time."
"What do you mean?"
she asked, thinking she misheard him.
"A time of great things is before us, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many, for forgiveness of sins."
The abbot turned to his bonsai trees and started clipping away at the leaves. He started to hum Amazing Grace.
"What should we do?"
Klein asked.
"Be a dear and send Captain Hollister to see me. It's time we took back the town,"
he replied. Paladin Klein's eyes widened and she smiled. She kissed the abbot's hand and left him to his gardening. Klein took the shortest path to the barracks and tried to look nonchalant as she looked around the corner of the church. The barracks was a 2-story rectangle made of thick-hewn stone, with a 4-story tower at one end used for storage. It looked like a swan drawn by a 4-year-old. This building was designed to survive invasion from the many enemies Britain had seen wash up on its shores. It was an inner bastion for the monks to hide, with thin windows and a thick oak door that could be barred with 2 iron sliders from the inside. A long banner was hung from the tower, and in the center a white crucifix and gold lettering with the words, "Servire custodire incorruptibilem esse," to serve, to protect, to be incorruptible. Klein felt her eyes well up every time she thought of the order's motto. Paladin Klein crossed the main courtyard to the barracks and went inside. She scanned the rooms as she walked to the women's bedroom upstairs. The bedrooms were utilitarian, with a bed and a locker for each night. Life was designed to be routine and simple when nights were at the abbey to offset the chaos of the outside world. Klein approached a group of knights in civilian clothes playing poker.
"Have you seen Captain Hollister?"
Klein asked. A well-built knight with her hair tied back in a neat ponytail looked from her group to Klein.
"I heard they were going up to the ranges,"
she replied. Klein nodded and walked over to her locker, opened it without looking at the dial and grabbed her rifle and plate carrier. The rank of paladin meant she didn't have to always carry her rifle like the other knights. Seniority has its difficulties, but also its benefits. Klein went outside to the motor pool and spoke to the requisitions officer. He sighed and pulled a clipboard off the wall of his office and flipped through the pages.
"You can use a quad bike, but I need it back no later than 1500,
he said. Bureaucracy had somehow survived the apocalypse. Pity. Klein picked the keys off the chest-high reception desk and went outside to the vehicles. An apprentice almost ran into her as he left the building and he apologized before starting to run again, with a large air filter in each arm. Klein tutted, then looked for the quad bike. The vehicles were arranged in rows with space between so any vehicle could exit the motor pool at any time. The smaller vehicles were placed by the southeast wall. She walked past pickup trucks and small SUVs before she could see the motorbikes and the lone green quad bike. She jumped on, started it up, and noticed the fuel gauge was nearly empty.
"Fuck's sake,"
she said. She looked around, disappointed there was nobody to hear her frustration. She drove out the motor pool and around the office where she had picked up the keys. An apprentice hurried to fill her vehicle up with a can of diesel. He saluted her, then went back to sitting on an old French-style wooden chair and stared blankly at the clouds. Christ almighty, who's in charge of recruitment around here? She laughed at the thought, then opened the throttle and skidded away across the gravel. The range was a 30-minute drive up into the Dales. It was outside the burn zone, so the threat of Type Bs was always a worry, but the natural geography of the land made it difficult for them to find somewhere to hide from the sun. She came to the turnoff and could see the sign for Heron North, a state-of-the-art firing range built before the outbreak. It was a 600-meter range with mechanical targets and cameras below each target to get real-time information on the shooter's accuracy. Designed for training the British Army, now it was the unofficial hangout for the STG, where they trained on the range and drank heavily in a small, stone-built office. She parked up next to a white Isuzu, with flared wheel arches and huge off-road tires. She walked around a stone building to the ranges. She could already hear the pops of unsuppressed gunfire and regretted not bringing ear protection. A row of 5 men lay on the ground, and Captain Hollister stood above them, pacing back and forward, clearly agitated. He kicked one of the men out of the way, lay down on the ground, and shouldered the large rifle. A moment later, a puff of dust was kicked up around Hollister, and a deafening shot rang out over the valley. Klein put her fingers in her ears and approached the line of shooters. They looked around at her, and Hollister ordered the men to stop firing.
"Paladin, have you come to touch up your shooting skills?"
he asked.
I have gotten a bit rusty sat behind a desk. But no, the abbot needs to speak to you.
"About?"
he asked.
I'm not privy to that, I'm afraid.
She replied. Hollister stood up and whacked his trousers with his palms to remove the dust.
"Oh, can't we play for a little longer?"
His men laughed.
No, it's urgent.
She replied.
"Tell you what, we'll shoot for it."
I haven't got time.
She replied, but Hollister cut her off.
"Hit a 300-meter target with this Accuracy International AX-50 and I'll come with you. If you miss, well then you can fuck off back to the abbey."
Bloody insolent twat. Fine.
She replied. One of the STG threw her a pair of green ear defenders and she kneeled, then lay by the rifle. Hollister moved to the right and she looked through the scope.
"Hang on,"
he said as he cycled the chamber.
"Keep your eye back from the scope," she kicks.
Klein looked through the scope and at 2 numbers at the bottom of her view. 300 was in red, 500 was in green. She pulled her eye away from the scope and looked on top, at the range dial, and clicked it down to 200 meters. She angled her face so her cheek was resting snug to the stock, and she squeezed the trigger. She felt the concussive blast through her chest, and she inadvertently coughed, then gave a sharp, giddy laugh.
"Hit,"
Chris Reeves said.
"Felt good, didn't it?"
Hollister said, so close her neck tingled.
Let's go.
She said.
"Slave driver."
Hollister replied. He stood up and followed Klein to the quad. When he removed his ear defenders, it was obvious the STG medic couldn't reattach the ear. Good thing he didn't wear glasses. Knight Anderson was bent over a workbench, milling a new receiver for a broken pistol. When it was finished, she would place it in the rack with the hundreds of other pistols in the basement below her workshop. She may even pick up a book on the way and come up with a reason to stay down there all afternoon. She liked being in the cache, surrounded by perfectly maintained weaponry. To her, it was better than any museum or art gallery. Well, what she imagined they were like. At 12, the armory door burst open, and 3 knights entered with rifles raised. She didn't look up from her work. There is always so much work thanks to apprentices limp wristing on their pistol drills, to drunk knights falling onto their service rifles.
"Just put them on the table.
Jess tapered off as she saw the rifle aimed directly at her. She pulled out her pistol, but hesitated when her sight settled on the head of Paladin Klein. Her hesitation was met with no mercy. 2 knights tackled her to the ground and slammed their fists down until her body went limp. Kicks crumpled her lifeless body until Klein stopped them. The knights dragged her out by her boots. Knight Campbell was in the stable, feeding his Shire horse from a bucket. Bess munched a cucumber, and he patted her neck as she ate. The smell of sawdust and leather tack filled the air. Campbell opened the top section of the stable door to freshen it up. A spider skittered out from the door jamb as he opened it. The Abbey's stable was much smaller than the town's, and there was only space for 1 horse. Campbell loved Bess. She had saved his life many times, and of course he had returned the favour. He ran his hand down her side and felt multiple mouth-sized scares. The vampire disease doesn't affect animals, but they are not immune to pain.
Vampires and humans are just as cruel, eh, lass?
She wasn't made for tilling fields, she was a fighter. Campbell held a handful of pears with the cores removed, and Bess gently picked them from his hand. He saw a flash of fear in her black golf ball-sized eyes before he was struck in the back of the head, and the world dissolved. 2 knights opened the large dining room doors and the STG entered first. They scanned the room with their weapons and green lasers passed over the knights and apprentices in the room. One laser stopped on the forehead of Charlie Dent. He would later swear he hadn't soiled himself. The knights were arrested and were forced at gunpoint out of the dining hall, across the courtyard, and down to the 2 cells under the chapel. Of the 150 knights at the abbey, only 90 were deemed loyal to the abbot. The other 60 were stood shoulder to shoulder, with no way out of the chapel basement. None of the apprentices were arrested. A group of loyal knights stopped them from leaving the dining hall until the abbot could speak to them. After it was confirmed the last of the undesirables were locked away, he sauntered into the great hall and stood between the dining tables and the kitchen. He scanned the faces of the teenagers in the room, staying silent to build tension.
I thank you all for your willingness to join the Order and protect the Abbey and everything for which it stands. We have restructured the organization, and those of you without knights will be assigned to new units.
The abbot said. With his businesslike statement now concluded, he walked out to the main courtyard and into the center of the gathered loyal knights.
We have purged the heretics without a single shot being flared. The Lord is truly on our side. Now we take back Ravendale and enforce the true word of God upon them. Captain Hollister, I want you and the STG to capture the council. The rest of you disarm the guards and put down any resistance,
the abbot said. When he finished talking, he strolled away and into the chapel. Sir, what is the plan of attack? One of the masked STG members asked. Hollister looked past the man at the beat-up truck known as Gramps.
I want that thing filling with ammonium nitrate and a SX4 explosive charge wired up to the airbag circuit. Jones, I want you wiring it up now,
Hollister said. He looked at the large group of knights. They were mostly good choices, good fighters, strong workers, and the ones that were neither would still do what they are told.
Which of you lucky bastards want to be a martyr?
Hollister said to the knights. Nobody volunteered. It didn't matter. He had 15 minutes to figure it out.
I want you all in full battle dress and in formation in the courtyard in 15 minutes.
The large group bounced into action, with some running to the armory, some back to the barracks, and a few engineers to the motor pool. Hollister noticed one knight wander back to his post guarding the main gate. He jogged forward to stop the man. He had found his volunteer.
Knight Penton, I have a special mission for you,
Hollister said in a soft voice. Penton turned.
I need to guard gate.
We have a special mission for you. Can you drive?
Hollister asked.
Show me how again, I forget things.
Penton replied.
That's okay, we will show you. I need to you deliver a special package to the town.
I can do that,
Penton replied. His eyes beamed with pride. Penton hadn't been the same since he was thrown into a wall by an eddy. If he wasn't wearing a helmet, his skull would have caved in. Hollister wondered if death was better than traumatic brain injury. Still, this man had his uses. Guarding a road nobody ever travels, cleaning up brass on the range, blowing himself up in a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. Day watch was the best shift a guardsman could ask for. You didn't need to worry about vampires, and the last of the raider gangs went silent decades ago. The only thing to worry about was Sergeant Pritchard. The elevated machine gun nest over the gate made it easy to see him coming. Ian looked back into the town and along the south wall all the way to the barracks. He pulled a brown bottle out from his coat pocket. He didn't usually like the one-off batches the brewery produced, but the golden syrup porter was delicious, and so strong it was a little obnoxious.
Got one for me, Ian?
Lucas asked. He lifted his head off the top of the 50 cal.
No, you need to watch the road,
Ian said. Lucas shrugged and gulped from a wine bottle. Ian sipped his beer but kept it close to his chest in case he needed to slip it back into his pocket. Lucas looked over the machine gun and pulled back the charging handle, loading a round.
Movement on the road to the south,
he said. Ian peered over the wall and looked through a spotting scope. He glassed the road south and could see a hulking vehicle driving up the road.
Friendlies from the Abbey,
he said.
Should we get Sergeant Pritchard?
Lucas asked.
Just in case.
Ian looked at the half-drunk bottle of red wine by the 50 cal.
No, they'll be heading north. They come in by foot for a drink,
he replied. Lucas nodded. At 18 years old, he was the youngest guard. He relied on the older guards for their wisdom, which there was plenty of, but poor quality. He had never heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The vehicle was one of the Abbey's armoured bin lorries. It must have been an old one. The engine sounded like a toolbox in an earthquake. The vehicle slowed, then turned off the main road towards Ravendale. Ian finished his beer, then threw the bottle over the wall towards the woods by the side of the road. He walked over to the gate controls and held his hand over the switch. Something stopped him from pressing it. The truck didn't slow down as it approached. Black smoke bellowed from the high exhaust. It was accelerating. The truck smashed through the wood and iron gate. The force shook Ian and he nearly fell over the wall onto the roof of the smoking vehicle. A moment later, a metric ton of ammonium nitrate exploded, sowing Ian and Lucas over the burn zone. The explosion took out the gate, the wall, and the guardhouse downstairs. Minutes later, 50 knights swept through the hole in the wall. Beyond the gate was the market square. The daily market had been full of people when the truck exploded. Now, those closest to the gate were gone, simply turned back into their individual particles. The people in the center of the square were dead or dying, and those at the far end had run away. Hollister and the rest of the STG ran through the gate and made straight for the town hall. A man reached up and grabbed Hollister's leg. His legs were gone.
"Shit, sir. Do we help him?"
Dan asked. Dan was the STG's medic, a damn good one too. Hollister kicked the man's hand away and ducked as a buzz of machine gun fire sprayed up a nearby wall.
Cover!
Hollister shouted. He jumped down from the rubble and dived behind a low wall. Hollister looked up to the second story of a stone-built house and saw the muzzle flash. He turned right and sprinted towards an alley with his team. At the gate, a squad of knights came over the rubble and were folded in half by the machine gun. An apprentice survived the initial burst and rolled down the rubble to find cover. The gunner focused his fire on the teenager. Hollister could see the other knights taking cover behind whatever they could find. They were pinned. He needed to deal with the machine gun.
STG, on me.
They circled around to the back of the house. They knew it was the right one as spent cases flew out of an upstairs window. Pete kicked in the back door and the STG made sure the ground floor was clear, firing through the walls as they walked down the hallway. Pete threw a grenade up the stairs. It exploded on the landing and kicked dust and plaster from the ceiling. They charged up the stairs and towards the room the gunfire was barking. As they approached the door, they opened fire into the wall. When their rifles were dry, they reloaded, then opened the door. A man lay over the machine gun and a woman lay in the corner of the room. She stared at Hollister like a caged tiger would to a fat child. A mixture of hate and submissive acceptance burned in her eyes. Hollister put a round through her right eye. Then he left.
Pete, get out there and tell the knights to get their asses in gear,
Hollister said. Pete nodded and ran out the door. Sporadic gunshots echoed off the ancient stone walls. After the machine gun nest was cleared, the STG marched to the town hall. The guards had no time to build defensive positions, so they cowered behind a low wall in front of the building. Hollister's team raised their rifles at 5 guards, who then immediately surrendered. They slunk down and shook with their arms raised high above their heads. A squad of knights came behind the STG and Zip tied their hands. Dan tried the front door, but it was barred. Hollister shot out an upstairs window before Dan and Pete climbed up. Pete leaned back out of the window and held up his thumb.
"We're clear,"
he said. Chris helped Hollister climb up, then went back to guard the prisoners laying on the floor. He kicked one just for the fun of it. The town hall consisted of a large open room on the ground floor and offices upstairs. Rows of chairs had been set out for the weekly meeting in the main hall. The townspeople could vote on any council decisions. It was the council's job to represent the people, but respect their decisions. Hollister thought it was ridiculous to let everyone have a say on the governing of Ravendale. They needed a strong leader like the abbot, or maybe himself. Hollister didn't expect any resistance from the council members, but the STG moved through the building methodically. The STG were the best close-quarter combat specialists at the abbey. They trained the other knights. At the top of the stairs, Hollister stepped around the corner to the hallway and aimed at the doors. Pete and Dan walked past and kneeled at each side of a door, their rifles ready to be aimed into the room when the door was opened. Hollister approached and planted his foot through the door, bursting it open into the room, then stepped back behind the wall.
Engage.
Pete and Dan aimed into the room, then went inside. They moved laterally out of the fatal funnel. A moment later, Dan came out with Councilman Carnegie. Hollister remembered the councilman was the father of one of Owen's apprentices, Florence Carnegie. She needed to be purged from the order. Her father would be a good bargaining tool when they find her. The STG cleared 3 more offices. The final prisoner was Elizabeth Bainbridge. She was the unofficial leader of the council and an open atheist. Hollister kicked her down the stairs, and she skidded across the polished oak floor of the town hall. The other council members rushed over to help her, but tried to avert their eyes from Hollister. His smile burned into their memory. They thought the abject cruelty seen soon after the outbreak was a thing of the past.
Sir, should I radio for the van?
Dan asked. Hollister was about to berate Dan for such a stupid question, then a wicked smile twisted his face.
No, we'll march them through town. Let the people know who's in charge now.
The other knights had control of the civilians. Things seemed to be over. They marched everyone from their homes, and a large crowd had gathered in the market square. Hollister was surprised to see the abbot, stood on the crumbled debris of the gatehouse. The STG led the council members to the centre of the market square, and Hollister left the group to talk to the abbot. As he approached, he could see the abbot had been crying.
Sir, the town is yours,
Hollister said.
We are united. Good,
the abbot said. It seemed to Hollister that the abbot was talking to himself, not noticing the people around him.
Captain Hollister, have you seen my thing anywhere?
The abbot asked. Hollister was confused.
Thing, sir?
Yes, man, James, have you seen him?
The abbot replied.
No, sir, is he not back at the abbey?
Hollister asked. The abbot leaned into Hollister.
I fear he has been kidnapped. Perhaps Elizabeth knows something. Take the rest of the council to the chapel basement. Take her straight to my house for questioning.
Hollister was a violent sociopath, but he was terrified by the abbot. The old man was becoming more paranoid by the day. His mind was slipping and opportunity was growing.